Welcome to the Smart and Soulful Money Podcast. I'm your host, Carrie B. VanWinkle. I'm a socially responsive investment advisor with Natural Investments, and a warm welcome to you. Today, my guest is Sara Loving. Sara Loving is a research associate at Just Money Advisors, focusing on better banking options. Sara graduated from Spalding University in 2017 with a degree in interdisciplinary social sciences and was brought into the company by her parents, Susan Taylor and Andy Loving, to research and write about sustainable banking practices. Sara is deeply passionate about all forms of social justice and believes that making better banking practices available to more people will lead to a more sustainable and equal society. She is the primary author on the Better Banking Options blog and maintains media outreach for the project. Welcome to the podcast, Sara.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Let me just provide a little more context here too. That Sara and I share an office space together at Just Money Advisors, and she works closely with what has really been this family passion project called Better Banking Options, which is now an amazing national resource for people who want to move their money towards institutions that better reflect their values and creating more positive impact in the world. So super excited to talk to you, and also very grateful for your other partners in this project, Susan Taylor, your mom, and Andy Loving, your dad, who also have been my mentors in personal finance work and for many years. And I'm very grateful to them both, and so happy to have you.
Yeah, I'm grateful to them too.
Before we get into more specifics about better banking options, let's look at the bigger picture of why does it matter where we bank? I think a lot of people don't really know so much about our banking system and why where we put our money really does matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not something that we're necessarily taught. So don't feel bad if you don't know these things. Just keep an open mind. But basically, the way banks theoretically should work is your deposits don't just sit there. They are used. Banks can leverage those deposits to make loans in your community or your neighborhood. So these loans can be small business, housing, they can be consumer loans, they can invest, a lot of larger banks do a lot of investment in stocks and other options, but the money shouldn't just be sitting there, it should be getting put to use. So when you make a deposit into an institution, you want to know that that bank is going to be making specifically quality loans, and we specify those as small business and housing loans because those are the loans that bring wealth into communities, and that's lasting wealth. It's not just a short-term donation project or a community outreach project like a lot of larger banks promote themselves doing. It's a long-lasting impact that comes from these types of loans. So yeah, you don't want your deposits just sitting there, and the good banks are going to do more than that. So that's why you need to be a little bit more intentional about where you bank to make sure that your money, while it's in the bank, can be doing as much good as possible.
It's going from what you gave is more of a neutral place where it's just sitting there towards something more positive, which, if this is the right way to say it, really helps build generational equity potentially in families and communities through small business lending and home ownership.
Yeah, those types of loans are the loans that build generational wealth because you can pass down a home to your family member, or you can pass down a business. They can continue the business. That's what allows upward mobility, those types of loans.
So I guess the other piece of this that we're aware of is what that institution is not doing with your money. So a lot of the big banks that we know about, the giant ones, they're really doing a lot of things with your deposits, with our deposits, that are very concerning and negatively impact people and planet. We've seen, how that affected funding for Dakota Access Pipeline, which big banks are getting attention for being huge funders of the fossil fuel industry. Those are just a couple of many, many, many examples.
We, like the big banks, when we talk about big banks, we don't mean all big banks necessarily. We're talking about like the top 10 or 20 largest banks in the country. And these banks hold like 95% of the banked assets in the country. So they hold a huge amount of assets. And this is what a lot of people don't know what too big to fail actually means. But these are the banks that are too big to fail. They receive ridiculous amounts of support from the government whenever there's some sort of crisis, because they hold so many assets that if they crashed or had a crisis, then the economy itself would collapse. So they just hold an enormous amount of power, and they work with huge companies like fossil fuel companies and basically some of the worst corporations in our country, because they have the amount of resources that are able to take care of those huge corporations. They do less housing lending and small business lending and participate more in what we call the unreal economy. They invest your deposits in stocks and speculative trading, which is not bringing capital to communities that need it the most. And they also traditionally have continually disinvested in low income and communities where people of color live. They don't go to those areas. They don't serve those areas traditionally.
And even if they are there or nearby and utilized by that community, my understanding is their business model is so extractive that they're really taking any wealth out of the community through that model and taking it to this unreal economy.
They may be taking deposits from that community, but they're not lending to the community, which is the important part. Another point is that they are privately owned by shareholders who, and of course, all banks are privately owned by shareholders. That's the difference between banks and credit unions. But even small banks, their owners or shareholders usually live in the community. They understand the needs of their customers and their employees, whereas these huge banks, their shareholders are very far removed from their customers, from the basic minutia of lending. So yeah, that's another point why the big banks, they don't really get what people actually need from the banking industry right now.
In those local communities.
And just in our community as a whole.
True. In our world.
Yeah, I mean, we could see from the 2008 financial crisis, like they're not good for any of us except for the big corporations.
You started to clarify there the difference between banks and credit unions. Say that again and maybe go into that a little bit more. What is the difference between a bank and a credit union?
The technical difference between a bank and a credit union is that banks are privately owned and have shareholders, and the purpose of the bank is to produce profits for those shareholders, whereas a credit union is owned and operated by the people who work there and the depositors. So they're only accountable to the people who keep money there, and it's a non-for-profit. So the purpose is not to make profit necessarily, but just to make enough profit that people get their basic interest rates and everything like that.
So it's a sustainable business model.
Yes. And even banks, depending on their mission and the way they operate, even the banks can look a lot like credit unions where profit is not their first priority. It just depends. They still have shareholders who ultimately have control.
From what you're saying, it's giving me the impression that a local bank, potentially a regional bank, is more rooted in the local communities and local economy in a very different way vastly different way than the big banks would be. But they still have the shareholders to answer to with a local bank. So what does that look like that's different? answering to their shareholders versus a big bank answering to their shareholders?
It's a enormous difference because the shareholders of a small local bank are usually community leaders. They are people who live in the areas that the bank serves. They intimately understand the needs of the community that they live in, and they care about the community they live in because they live there. They naturally have a much more vested interest in making sure that the loans that they make the world a better place.
So Sarah and I are having this conversation on an interesting day at an interesting time. It's Earth Day 2020, April 22nd, 2020, and we're right in the midst of moving through the coronavirus pandemic. And also just recently, like you mentioned specifically small businesses, Sarah, recently the CARES Act was passed and then quickly ran out of money, where a lot of small businesses were shut out and a lot of banking institutions were shut out. And it was really where the big guys again, obviously the system is set up to serve the ones who are always served and served well. And this was just another example where a lot of local financial institutions, and then even more so, a lot of really important businesses that create a thriving local economy all over our country have been shut out so far from this support that they desperately need. So would you like to speak about that?
It does make sense that our government bails out the big banks because so many people bank there, which is why it's so important to move our money. The more we move our assets from those big banks and to smaller local institutions, the more we say, hey, we don't need these guys. We don't need you to bail them out. That's basically what I take from it, is that it just goes to show how much more we need to not only disinvest in the mega banks, but also invest in small local institutions so that our money is there and they have more control over capital getting to small businesses in times of crisis like this. There are banks out there who are offering loans right now to small businesses and even to families who are struggling with the financial burden of the COVID crisis. And that's a great indicator of those banks actually caring about the communities they work in.
I had this visual of taking the fire hose of like cash just being blown out of a big fire hose towards the big banks in our current structure, cash from us as depositors and cash from, like you said, even the government itself to bail them out. And I think of it as switching from this giant fire hose, directing so much money towards these top big banks and redirecting it into local communities with more of a garden hose approach, and just really nurturing thriving local community economies and state economies and regional economies through the redirecting of, this precious resource through more of a garden hose approach. I can visualize the fertile ground, that is creating. And where my thought then goes is how in many ways our economy reflects our food system, and where the economy cannot be a monoculture, just like our food system can't be a monoculture. We see all the problems that it creates when our food system is so dependent on these huge monocultures. And I see so many of that, and it sounds like you do too, that we have similar problems with the monocultures within our economic system. And you're speaking to one of them right here, which is so much concentration of our national wealth in these big banks.
Yeah. And they're not doing good things with it. Like you mentioned, in loaning to fossil fuel companies, and also tying back to farming. We love to support banks that do small farm loans, but the big banks do a lot of funding of huge farm industries because, again, the big banks have the resources to actually provide banking services for those companies. So yeah, it's just another connection to how messed up it all is.
Yeah. What's the issue with transparency in the banking industry? You've created some great writing pieces that people can find on the Better Banking Options website. And one of the topics you really focused on was the issue with transparency in the banking industry. And I'd love for you to talk about that.
It's super fascinating because it goes to a federal level, and especially our current administration has just been, it's an administration of deregulation. And this definitely applies to the banking industry and really affects the transparency of it, because all banks and credit unions are required to report certain data about where they're lending and how much they're lending. But they're required each year to report less and less on that. So we don't know where they're lending. So banking sites like ours and others are unable to get the data that we need to properly compare banks. And yeah, that's an issue that we've come up with running our search engine, because only certain banks have the data available about whether they lend to specifically low income census tracts. Not all banks are required to report that anymore. So we couldn't include it in our search engine because we needed to be able to compare all institutions in an area. So it's just things like that. We need the government specifically to require banks to report where they're lending. And that's the biggest issue right now. It's just so important that we know that specifically.
It's interesting because there's been a move, it seems like each year towards more and more transparency around corporate responsibility reporting. So more and more large companies are agreeing to have sustainability reports, for example.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's just continued to move away in some ways in the financial industry, where less and less of them, is that true to say, are actually reporting in a transparent way?
Yeah, absolutely. And the mega banks particularly definitely use this to their advantage. And they also, they'll mess with the data or the statistics. So they'll say, oh, we donated however many $1 million to this cause, or we loaned however many $1 million to this cause. But when you look at that as a percentage of their total assets, and you're looking at what percentage of my deposits are going to be going to these things, it's such a tiny amount. So having that data required to be publicly available is just incredibly important, so that we can accurately compare all of the institutions and see which ones are lending the most to the areas that need it the most.
Tell me about the mission of Better Banking Options.
Basically, our mission is mostly educational. We want to inform people about the power of banking and what their banking choices can do to change their world. And we want to give people all the knowledge that they need to make the best banking choices that they can. Because a lot of people, while they don't understand how the banking industry works, they don't understand how their deposits work. And honestly, you don't really need to. You just need to know that your deposits are loaned out to your community, and we can provide you with the information that you need to, as far as what banks and credit unions near you are doing the most lending. And yeah, that's part of our mission. And then our eventual goal is to inspire change in the banking industry, to inspire more transparency, and to encourage the mega banks, because I don't think the mega banks are ever going to disappear completely, but we need to put pressure on them to do the kind of lending that we're looking for. Because I think that if we make sure that they know that people care about where their deposits are put, and that influences their banking choices, I just want more people to care about that, basically, is the whole mission of the project.
So people can find better banking options at betterbankingoptions.com. You have this pretty new version of your website that is built as a fantastic and important resource for people, like I said, all over the country to be able to go to and find a local financial institution where they can move their money that better aligns with the impact that they want to have in the world. And from what I've seen, the work that you all are doing and the site itself really showcases a few things. You've been doing the research and writing articles about small financial institutions across the country that are really worth spotlighting in the positive impact they're having in their communities. And you're also building the conversation, it seems like, helping people better understand why it matters where you bank. And then the heart of this site is this search engine that you all have developed and have made available for free to people to use to find the local institution that they'd like to move their money to.
Super exciting. We've been working on it for a while, so we would encourage people to use it as much as they can and to let us know what they think of it. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out to us through our website or our email address, betterbankingoptions@gmail.com. But yeah, it's a great resource. Essentially, you put in your zip code or your city and give it a search radius from 5 to 30 miles, and it'll show you the banks and credit unions in that radius that are doing the most quality lending. And that's the primary weight. We also look for banks that are local, that have most of their branches in the area, that are smaller in size, and that are located in low-income census tracts. But ultimately, the thing that we look at is, are they lending a significant amount of their assets in small business, small farming, and housing loans?
So we can't assume that even though a bank is a local bank, that they're actually using those deposits to focus on things that we would like to see them focus on, like you said, which one of the big things is building equity in families and communities that it's most needed through those small business and homeownership loans and the agriculture too. That's great.
Yeah.
Those things that you just said, are those the criteria? So what I'd like to do is I'm going here to betterbankingoptions.com. You've got this nice spot at the top that's a green star where I can click. It says find banks, and I just click on that. And then, like you said, I'm doing it now. I'm plugging in my zip code, and I can change. I'm going to do a 5-mile search radius, but you said it could be 5 to
30. If you're looking in Houston, you can look at all of Houston.
Very cool. Okay. And then I click on find better banks. Oh, okay. And so you've got some explanation here of what makes a better bank. So I guess this is how each of these are evaluated.
Mm-hmm.
Building community wealth, serving the underserved, locally focused, and small enough to serve. Tell me about those 4 criteria.
The biggest one is quality lending. And that's the loans that we were talking about: small business, housing, small farming. And that's not just if they're doing those types of lending, but what percentage of their assets are going to that lending, and what percentage of their total assets are being lent out. Because a lot of banks, they may do most of their lending in one of these areas, but they sit on 70% of their deposits. So it's not just what types of lending, it's how much of their assets they're lending. And then the second weight is whether they're located in low income and moderate census tracts. And these are areas that are typically neglected by traditional banks. Basically, they want their branches in higher income areas because that's where most of the money comes in. And it costs a lot of money to operate a physical branch. So a lot of traditional banks don't consider it a viable option to open up branches in low-income census tracts. So we want banks and credit unions that are making an effort to reach out to those communities. And then the other two things that we look at are the branch density, which is how close their other branches are to the headquarters, and then the asset size. So how much in assets the bank holds. But those are weighted much lower than the quality lending. We do like smaller institutions, but there are plenty of regional or even national banks that do good work, that make an effort to know the communities they work in. So not all big banks or widespread banks are necessarily bad. It's just an added plus if they have those things.
I got a result here that when I put in my zip code, it gives me a good number of options, from credit unions to banks, and it's really great to see. It tells me where the closest branch of that institution is in relation to me, and then how each of those rated in each of the 4 areas that you just said. So if one of those areas is of particular importance to me, then I can see how they rated in that area.
We really developed the search engines specifically. The problem that we were finding when we were looking at other banking sites is that they were only providing a list of CDFIs, which is a banking designation. And not everyone has a specifically designated bank or credit union in their area. So we wanted to make sure that everyone could, at least, even if it's not a great bank, they could move their money to a better bank than the one they're using now. They can disinvest in the mega banks. And even if your bank is not doing a huge amount of lending, it's still monumentally better than keeping your assets in Chase or wherever else.
What's your thought about a bank with a local presence or a regional presence versus some of the online bank options that are marketing themselves as more socially and environmentally focused?
I think that those online options are a great tool and resource for people who, there are a lot of people who move every year. There are a lot of people who travel a ton for work, and they want to be able to access their bank account anywhere. And local options may not be able to provide that. And I think that the online banks do offer some services that the smaller local institutions are just simply unable to provide. And because they don't have physical branches, the costs are lower and the fees may be lower. But the difference is, you may be able to tell, okay, this much is going to environmental causes, this much is going to wherever, but you don't know it's going to have the same local impact, and it's not going back into your community, which is the most impactful thing that you can do with your deposits, is to bring it back into your own local neighborhood. And the physical branches also are able to reach out to at-risk communities and people who are underbanked and who would never consider online banking options. They can really work in those communities and fully understand the challenges that they face in a way that online options just can't fully address. So they really get down to the nitty-gritty work of it.
That's a great point that I hadn't thought about before. It's almost like this exclusive space online that you're engaging with when you might go to one of these online only options that are not rooted in a local community. So interesting, because they do a good job. There's a couple that I can think of right now that have done a nice job with their marketing and their messaging, and they do seem attractive in certain ways. And especially for people, I know I have my business accounts at a local credit union here, and locally rooted institutions still have plenty of online services.
Almost all of them do now.
But what you're saying, you're really not contributing to supporting institutions that support the communities most at need when you're maybe using that kind of option potentially.
If you're looking for a great online option that, like, it's a regional chain, Hope Credit Union or Hope Federal Credit Union, they're independent institutions, but they basically work on the same level, and they have a wealth of online and mobile banking options, but they work in the Mississippi Delta region, they work in Compton, they work in at-risk neighborhoods in Chicago. They really make an effort to reach out to communities that are the most underbanked and that just need housing and small business loans the most.
I know you've written a great article about Hope Credit Union and done some wonderful research about the impact that they provide and how they are so rooted and have important relationships they developed in the local communities.
Yeah, so that's a great example of how a bank can do both. They're pretty sizable. They have many different branches and they're all over the country, but they still have that local focus and that commitment to their mission. And that's what's important.
And their primary presence, my understanding, and where they've kind of gotten their start is the Delta region, the Mississippi Delta region. Is that right?
I know that they were founded in North Carolina, but moved down to the Mississippi Delta, and that's where they've opened the most branches and kind of have concentrated their efforts in a lot of ways, because that's the poorest region of the country at the moment. So they need a lot of capital to be brought to that area.
And probably a lot of people who don't tend to feel comfortable engaging with traditional banking services. In our conversations with them, they've made some powerful headway in building relationships and engaging with people who never thought they would engage with a bank or be supported by a bank.
And a lot of people don't recognize that there are many populations in this country that don't trust banks, whether they be immigrants or non-English speakers or women or people of color, or historically all of those groups of people have been shut out by traditional banks. The more banks we have specifically creating opportunities for those people, the better.
My podcast audience is primarily women, and supporting women engaging confidently in their money life in a way that feels aligned to their values as well. And I know you were raised in this rich in meaning, rich in purpose, for sure, family environment by your parents. Susan Taylor, your mom, has her PhD in economics. She actually worked for a number of years at Bank of America as an economist. So you all understand both perspectives so powerfully. Your father, Andy Loving, who along with Susan has worked for many years to build their socially responsible investment business, Just Money Advisors. So you've been raised in this conversation, in this environment, and also in a very dedicated space around social justice. And then you are a gifted writer, and how your commitment to social justice and your talent and passion for writing, I love how you've really brought this into your work now, the research and writing that you're doing really for a cause that you believe so powerfully. And so tell me about you personally and you're doing this work and why it matters to you.
Honestly, I got out of college hoping to be a community organizer. So doing stuff a little bit more radical than this, I guess. But when I fully started to understand just how much banking makes a difference, when you say that banks can leverage your dollars, that means that they can take 10 times what you deposit and lend it out. So it's just a huge impact. And it's such a simple change that literally anyone can make. And it makes a huge difference. So once I realized that there was just a huge opportunity here to get people to move their money, which is just so easy and makes such a big impact, I just got really encouraged. And art and writing have also always been a big part of my life. So I started thinking about, okay, how are we going to get people to care about this? How are we going to get people to realize that banking is not as boring as you think it is, and that you can make a difference with your deposits? It's been really interesting to see how emotionally compelling that can be to people. One of the biggest parts of my job has been figuring out how to convey that, and to convey what a big difference that this makes. It's been really great to not only get to work with my parents and learn from them and learn what banking means for our society, but to also get to see the specifics of what the banks do and the difference that they make in people's lives.
Where do you all want to take things from here with the project?
I want to move it in a direction of more of a social movement, getting more people engaged with putting pressure on banks to do more quality lending, and then also educating people on banking legislation so that they have the resources to be able to vote for, not only in federal elections, but in local elections, for people who are going to make sure that the banking industry stays transparent. That's one of my biggest plans, is to keep up more with banking legislation so that we can educate our readers about what's going on there, and then to also bring more people in to this movement of changing where you bank, so that the big banks start to get a little intimidated and start to reconsider some of their practices.
The instinct might be, oh, it really, do they really care? Do they really listen? But we have seen how Wells Fargo, listened. It took a while, but through shareholder advocacy and other pressures, listened and divested out of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And how Chase Bank has much more to go, but has also made some changes based on the different pressures that they've gotten. So even the biggest can be impacted when we come together with a focused effort. Yeah.
Absolutely. And they're still not great banks, don't let them trick you into thinking that. But it's always better for them to do better. It's always better for more capital to be brought to communities that need it. Money really does talk in our society. So making that change is, even if you only have a few $100 in a checking account at Chase, if you and everyone you know has a few $100 there, moves it to a local institution, that's thousands of dollars in deposits they're losing. And all of that really does add up. It may not seem like a lot, but it really is sort of a drop in the bucket scenario. Like it really does add up, and they care. They want your money.
So circling back around to what you were saying, your idea before you started working in this project, your idea was that your work was going to look differently in the world, that your activism was going to look differently. And I can see a parallel with myself where, and especially in, earlier in my life, I had this idea about what activism looked like and what creating change in the world looked like. And it was a very more specific idea of that, and it was signs in the streets, and it was different, the way that I thought activism had to look. And I think you and I both realized there's a broader version of what activism can look like and what it needs to look like. I feel like the Better Banking Options project is really rooted in an everyday activism.
Absolutely. And that's the type of activism that is realistic. I think that a lot of people who are socially motivated have this idealistic idea of it. The whole signs out in the street thing, it's so poetic. It's so almost self-indulgent in a way.
And it is important. There's an importance to it.
It is somewhat unrealistic in some ways as well, in regards to the average person being able to do that. And, or at least on the daily, you know, most people work, they can't go to protests every weekend. A lot of people don't want to mess with money. They don't want to think about money when it comes to changing the world and social aspects. You want to look past it, but it is the reality of the world we live in. And where our money is diverted and where it goes makes all the difference. And yeah, that's why banking is so important, because banks essentially decide where money in our society goes.
The powerful thing too about the everyday activism of where you bank is that it doesn't matter how much you have in investment accounts. It doesn't matter how much, like you said, even how much you have in a bank. It's something that so many people can do. And even in a time of being shut in our homes in a pandemic, we can move our money and make this change towards something.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many online and mobile resources now for banking that you can pretty much do anything from your home. So if you're thinking about making a change, call your bank. Do some research first. Go on our website and then call your bank and tell them you're moving your money.
Now, why is that important? I shouldn't just move my money. I should call my bank currently and tell them I'm moving my money. Why is that important?
It basically just lets them know that you care about where they're lending. You know, if you were doing more community lending, I wouldn't be moving my money. You know, it's just telling them, hey, this is something you should care about.
So it can be an important part of the activism of it, or the change of it, is not only just quietly moving your money, but making that statement to them at the same time, you know, this is why I'm doing this.
Yeah, and making that statement to everyone. Post it on your Facebook. Hey, I'm moving my money. The more people that do this, the more impact it's going to have. You're already going to be going to the bank. You're already going to be dealing with banking practices. So why not just make one simple change, and then going forward, all of your banking practices are going to be, every time you do that, it's going to be doing something good for the world.
I think it can be overwhelming for people to think about, even though it seems simple, I'm just going to move my money to a different bank. Actually implementing that can feel overwhelming, especially if you've got online banking set up and different things. And so you all have a great resource. It looks like on the Better Banking Options website, it looks like it's under resources, key articles, and you've got an article, how to move your money, where you give us more step-by-step how to make it a bit easier and manageable for us to do that. And we'll post the direct link to that article.
If you're thinking about making your life align more with your values, this is a great one-step thing that everyone can do to invest in their communities. So if you're thinking about it, go to our website. That is betterbankingoptions.com. Use our search engine. Just put a map in front of that URL, map.betterbankingoptions.com, and put in your zip code, and you can find the banks in your area that are doing the most quality lending. We make it easy for you.
What a great resource. Thank you so much, Sara.
Thank you.